Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be providing an introduction to Beowulf, specifically to provide historical context and that will help with analysis. Unfortunately, most of this video is going to be devoted to a PowerPoint presentation. However, until I can create something that's a little bit more interesting, this is what I've got to work with. So I hope you enjoy. Okay, so the title of this presentation is Transitioning Cultures, Beowulf and the Epic Tradition. I use this title mainly to highlight the two main features of Beowulf that I want you to focus on as you're reading it. So specifically, the fact that Beowulf is an example of British culture transitioning from pagan to Christian. It also is an example of an even older kind of cultural artifact, and that is the heroic epic. And so those are the two things I definitely want you to focus on as you're reading Beowulf. First, the heroic epic tradition. So the key features of heroic epics include the display of society's ideals or values. So they oftentimes include the characteristics or values that the society seems to want to uphold, or the values that they epitomize. So epics are often written in a high or formalized style. This is usually to indicate or at least the writers attempt to match the writing style with the epicness of the story itself. They also include a focus on masculine concerns. Even more modern epics that include female heroines, like The Hunger Games, for example, often display masculine characteristics. So Katniss herself, as a hunter, as a provider for her family, oftentimes is not seen as a very feminine character. In fact, she seems to resist characteristics that are typically attributed to femininity. Heroic epics also include journeys or obstacles that the hero has to overcome. They often also include sacrifices that the hero has to make in order to essentially save the world, which leads into the next characteristic of the fact that the hero's actions in an epic oftentimes have macrocosmic consequences. Now, Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell have also interpreted heroic epics as expressions in psychological maturity, in that the hero grows as the journey progresses, psychologically speaking. So here's some examples of epics, including from going back from the ancient times to today. They include Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, Virgil's The Aeneid, Dante's The Divine Comedy, which is not a comedy in the sense that we know of today. It just means that it has a happy ending. Also Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, John Milton's Paradise Lost. Some modern examples include Harry Potter, Star Wars, The Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings, and even comic books. Specifically, or at least for two examples, the Marvel and DC universes. So second, we have the pagan and Christian influences of the poem. So the story of Beowulf is actually set in the 5th century of the Christian era. So this is before Christian conversion of pagans was completed. We know that the story itself was written by a Christian author, and that Beowulf and Hrothgar are considered by the author to be enlightened pagans, and that even though they do follow pagan traditions, they are actually more closely aligned with Christianity within the story. We also see references to Christianity through Grendel's ancestry, so definitely pay attention to when the author actually does identify a history of Grendel, and you actually get to see who Grendel is related to. So even though Christianity definitely seems to be the focus of the poem, pagan culture has not been completely replaced. So for example, there's a focus on warrior society, a privileged relationship between warrior and his thane, and there are also numerous references to gold and pagan burial rituals. So the story of Beowulf was originally composed around the 8th century of the Christian era, and unfortunately we don't know who wrote the story. We do know, however, that it does come down from an oral tradition, so the story is actually older than the 8th century, but the text that we have is the one that was written down. So, oral traditions oftentimes were used to pass down histories or pass down cultural values. And so, Beowulf, as written down, is kind of is one of the few texts from the era that was actually set down to page. So J.R.R. Tolkien himself actually characterized the epic as a heroic elegy, in that it seems to have a funeral tone, or it seems to be mourning something that has been lost. So the story itself follows the adventures of the title character and is largely, at least by most scholars, separated into three distinct sections, typically associated with the monster that Beowulf fights. So that includes Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon. And of course, what we see is the progression of Beowulf's development as he encounters and defeats all three of these monsters. So in terms of language development, Beowulf was originally written down in Old English. Now a lot of students get confused with this because they oftentimes consider Shakespeare's language as Old English. And while Shakespeare is old, it's actually modern English, or at least more closely related to modern English than Beowulf is. In fact, the only way you'd be able to read Beowulf in its original text is if you actually learned Old English. Most readers today are not able to read Beowulf unless it's in translation. So we are actually going to be reading Beowulf in translation. As a language, in terms of the language tree, English is has Germanic roots. And at the time that Beowulf was written, English was considered to be barbaric and a low culture, or at least evidenced by a low culture. So it wasn't highly valued. On the right of the screen here, what you can see is actually is what Old English looks like. And just even as a quick glance, you can actually tell that it is very, very different from modern English. Now, as for what Old English sounds like, unfortunately, I cannot speak Old English, and so I'm going to have to rely on a YouTube video of someone actually using the language, or at least what we think Old English probably sounded like.
Je vet vad Nelsian sitter nicht bekom han huses, hu hit kringdena efter bertea je byn hafton. Vanta där inne att linga je drikt sväfan efter symbol. Sorgen är kutan vonkärt vera, wicht onhel och grim och greidi, jeros sona was, reuch on reta on rasta janam, riktigt dena. Han on efter vet, huse kremning to pam feren, mid fara wal fyle, wika neosan. Da was on uktan mid daja, rendles kufkraft on derne. Da was efter witta.
So I hope you actually heard at least one word that sounded familiar, and that word was probably Grendel. But as you can tell, most of the other words that you would probably hear do not sound like modern English today. In fact, they actually sound a little bit closer to what we might consider to be German today. And so here's a list of a few references that I used in composing this particular presentation. They include Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces and J.R.R. Tolkien's seminal essay Beowulf, the Monsters, and the Critics. And of course, the Norton Anthology of English Literature has fantastic introductory materials that provide historical context for Beowulf.